Senator Ludlam.
Thanks, Mr Acting Deputy President. Look, the Greens don't support this deceptive, misguided and outright offensive bill. I will address some of the comments that Senator Brandis has just made, and it's interesting that by way of supporting his argument about why not to take a look at Greens amendments, he spoke of a bill that's not even before the Parliament. I will address, when we get to the committee stage, the detailed arguments and the reasons why I believe this bill should pass this chamber if it's amended. But in its present form, we're better off without the bill. And that, I think, considering the role that the Australian government has played, or the role that it said it has played in supporting the outlawing of these hideous weapons, that's a pretty sad thing to have to come in here and say. That not just Australia, but the global community and those who've worked for a decade to bring this treaty into this convention into force are now saying they'd rather Australia didn't ratify it because of the example this sets. This is not a point of view that the Greens have arrived at alone. Sometimes I feel as though, as a member of the crossbench, I come in here as an Australian Greens senator, if it's on a bill that I strongly oppose, with a view to try and explain in detail my point of view so that senators from other parties will understand why it is that we oppose the bill. In this instance, that's not why I'm going to bother, because I know very well that senators from both of the old parties also deeply oppose this bill. One of the reasons that it's taken so long to bring it to the chamber is that there was substantial dissent, both from the Coalition Party and in the Labor caucus room, about what they had been hearing about this bill and about the flaws that are inherent within it. So I don't feel as though I need to explain to other senators why we shouldn't be voting for this bill in its present form, but I'm going to do so nonetheless to place it on the record so that others, looking back at the Hansard record in years to come, will understand that this chamber voted for this bill in the full knowledge of just how badly flawed it is. Human Rights Watch and the Harvard Law School have said the bill creates a defence for many acts during such operations that on their face violate the Convention. So not only does the drafting of this bill violate the spirit of the Convention, it violates its letter. And that in fact the Australian government is attempting to pass legislation that would bring us into accord with the Convention, and no doubt there'll be a press release that goes out from the Minister either very late tonight or sometime tomorrow morning, depending on when this bill passes, cheerleading the government's accession to the Convention. And the government, I guess, should not be too surprised at the total absence of applause from the arms control community and those who have been shepherding and watchdogging this convention from the day it was conceived to these sorry sets of events. Former Prime Minister Fraser says the government has drafted legislation scattered with alarming loopholes that, to my mind, directly undermine the spirit and intention of the Convention. General Peter Gratian, former CDF, has said the wording used in our legislation goes well beyond that required for interoperability with the US and in fact doesn't follow a couple of the key things that the Convention is about. As a former CDF, this is someone who cares deeply about Australia's military capabilities. Paul Barrett, former Secretary of the Defence Department, says legislation in these terms is clearly at odds with a convention whose central purpose is to prevent the use of cluster munitions. Mr Acting Deputy President, you guided the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Committee, if I'm not wrong, in its examination of this bill, which is now, I guess, more than a year on. It was referred to that committee because the Scrutiny of Bills Committee said the legislation in its present form is actually strikingly at odds with what the Joint Standing Committee on Treaties had come up with. And so I don't feel, although we will be alone, I suspect, I haven't consulted with the crossbench, we'll be alone later tonight or tomorrow when this bill is put to the vote in terms of numbers in the chamber, but we are not alone in terms of the numbers of people whose hopes have been violated by the government choosing to bring this bill back in unamended form. Why is this important? I believe many senators, apart from myself and some of my Greens colleagues, had the good fortune to meet Siraj Ghulam Habib, who is an Afghan boy who lost both his legs as a child and part of one of his hands and was left for dead. His cousin was killed in the same blast. These weapons are indiscriminate. And they could, if you wanted to design a weapon that targeted civilian children, I'm not sure that you could come up with something better than these devices. Now, all senators, when they stand up and address this bill, will claim a horror equal to mine in the fact that these weapons are deployed, and I suspect they will claim that they want to see the elimination of these weapons, and indeed that's why Australia is signing up to the convention. The fact that we are signing up to a convention in a way that fundamentally sabotages its objectives, it's not just me saying that, that is voices from here in Australia and voices from around the world who have followed this convention from its initial drafting to today, are saying this is the wrong way, we must go back. Siraj was left for dead. His cousin was dead. He was taken to the morgue, and an uncle actually realised he was alive and pulled him out of there, and he is now one of the world's foremost advocates for this convention, for the elimination of these horrific weapons from the arsenals of countries around the world. Now, Australia has a good record in this account, in that we experimented with the use of cluster weapons quite some time ago, and I believe it was actually not even a doctrinal decision that originated from a policy level, but in fact the ADF didn't want them. They had no use for weapons of this kind, indiscriminate weapons that lie on the battlefield long after the conflict or the front has passed and continue to maim and kill people. So the ADF gave them up. We've never deployed them in our arsenal to any great degree. Our great and powerful ally, the United States, on the other hand, takes the opposite view and has refused to become a party to the convention. And so that is where one of the great and most problematic issues around this legislation as currently drafted arises. The bill, as it is drafted, allows Australian forces to store, transport and assist in the use of cluster weapons, and it does not outlaw direct and indirect investment in companies producing these weapons. These are not accidental loopholes or accidental flaws. Of course, they're not. We are one of 108 countries that signed the 2008 Convention on Cluster Munitions, and a large number of other countries also signed on the same day. Now, we know, and this is going to sound perhaps a little bit extreme, the idea that Australia would simply adopt the negotiating tactics of a party that not only deployed cluster weapons, but was refusing to sign on to the convention and was insisting that it would continue to deploy these weapons because, in their view, they still have some residual military utility. And of course, I'm referring to the United States. Heaven forbid that Australia, as a party to the convention, would simply do the United States government's bidding on its way through the negotiations, and I particularly refer to the drafting of Article 21. Well, we know in fact that this is not some outlandish conspiracy theory. We know word for word exactly what the Australian government was up to, and we know this because of the cable releases that were put into the public domain by the WikiLeaks organisation. And it's ironic that today, 18 hours after its editor-in-chief, Julian Assange, has been granted political asylum and is speaking from the window of an embassy in London about his desire to call the dogs off on whistleblowers around the world, that we are reminded of exactly why this organisation and those like it is so important. And not just the WikiLeaks organisation, of course, but those mainstream media organisations that took those releases, understood their importance and ran them on the front page of the world's newspapers. We know, for example, through cable traffic between the US Embassy in Washington and here in Canberra, that Australia was doing just that. We were simply running sock puppet arguments on behalf of the United States government, seeking to undermine the very objectives of the treaty. Not just us alone, of course. We worked with a number of other like-minded countries seeking to do the bidding of the United States government to effectively allow a number of key flaws in the bill. And as far as these concern Australia, the two major ones are interoperability, i.e. how do we participate and collaborate with United States military operations when we are a party to the convention and they are not? And what are the boundaries? Now, in the Australian Greens, we actually support the intent that says the fact that we may in the future, and certainly have on many occasions in the past, seek to conduct joint operations with the US government shouldn't in itself preclude us from joining the treaty. It should be possible to come up with a form of language that says we can participate in joint operations as we are in Afghanistan, but we will have nothing to do with the deployment or use of cluster weapons. So the principle of interoperability is sound. It's drafted into the treaty in language that is reasonably sound and was tortuously negotiated. And then it's been dramatically undermined and turned 180 degrees in the wrong direction by the drafting in this bill. WikiLeaks in this case, again, showed why we need organisations like this, so that this kind of sick behaviour does not go on behind closed doors, but is actually exposed to public scrutiny, so that we know that while government spokespeople on the one hand are saying we're all for it, let's get signed up, let's make sure that these weapons are banned, on the other hand, we are negotiating as though we deployed these things ourselves. So we weren't successful in undermining the language in the treaty. In fact, it's not how the negotiations turned out at all. The convention is a ban, and the language is universal. It is a ban. We have positive obligations as a signatory to the convention to encourage others to forego the use of these horrific weapons as well. So Australia in that instance actually was unsuccessful in watering down the terms of the convention that we're now seeking to sign up to. So the fallback position obviously is to embed in domestic legislation precisely the grotesque loopholes that we were trying to write into the convention itself. So we didn't succeed in undermining the convention on behalf of all the states parties that wanted to sign up, the vast majority of the world's people. So instead, we have this rather grubby little attempt at drafting it into the domestic legislation. And it is the job of this chamber to fix those flaws. What I had been hoping, certainly in response to what I knew, and from Senator Birmingham's behalf, I understand won't be present for the debate tonight, which is a great shame. I would have been very, very interested to hear his views on the final passage of the bill. From the point of view of the Labor Party, there are many people I know who have grave concerns about this bill, and that is one of the reasons that it's been delayed for so long. Perhaps Senator Marshall can enlighten us when he's able to speak. And perhaps not. Perhaps everybody's happy. Perhaps you were persuaded by your briefings, and perhaps the bill is fine and all of our concerns are overblown. However, the bill needs, in my view, to be drafted, and we have amendments that will give these effect to reflect the continued application of the Convention's prohibitions, including the prohibition of assistance during situations of inoperability. And the thumbnail sketch, the version that has been put to me, is that the way that this bill is drafted, and I will take these issues up in detail when we get to the committee stage, is that we can carry the weapon onto the field, we can load it, we can help aim it, as long as somebody else's finger is on the trigger when it's fired. Now that is in direct violation to the explicit drafting in the Convention. And if that's the case, by all means, either back away, and the Australian government can say, we can get a statement from the Defence Minister tomorrow saying as objectionable and horrific as these devices are, we still support their use by other parties. Or, alternately, come clean and say that this bill has been drafted with intentional loopholes to enable our ally not just to use them during joint operations which would directly implicate Australian forces, but also, and our second tranche of amendments will cover these issues, the bill needs to be amended in relation to jurisdiction issues which explicitly allow foreign forces to use Australian territory to stockpile and transit cluster bombs. Now, perhaps 2 years ago, when this legislation was first conceived of, that all seemed to be somewhat academic. Now we have a US Marine Corps gradually assembling itself, a US Marine Corps base gradually being assembled quite close to Darwin. We have a US Air Force base being established at Tyndall. No doubt government spokespeople will jump up later and have a go at me for using the word base. But to be honest, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, US Air Force bombers and fighter jets based at Tyndall in the Northern Territory. Persistent rumours that blew out into the open a couple of weeks ago about a US naval facility in Coburn Sound. That's my home port as well. So the idea of US forces transiting themselves and these weapons through Australian ports, through Australian facilities, stockpiles, isn't academic at all. This bill explicitly allows the United States or other foreign military forces to stockpile these weapons, which the Australian government will later tonight or tomorrow put out a press statement saying, oh, we oppose their existence at all, we hope they're banned. And yet we're okay for them to be stockpiled here in Australia. If my reading of the drafting of the bill is incorrect, then I look forward to having that pointed out. Otherwise, I look forward to the support of senators on both sides when we put the amendments to the vote. The third major area of amendments, which is something that I would have thought would have been the easiest to fix, and this is the one that the WikiLeaks revelations are silent upon, and that I thought might be a genuine drafting error, rather than a deliberate attempt to sabotage the objectives of the Convention. And this, of course, refers to investment. We will have obligations under the treaty to ban all forms both of direct and indirect investment in cluster munitions. Now, this echoes calls most persuasively put during the inquiry by the Australian Council of Super Investors on behalf of the Australian financial industry, who came to us and said, you have to tighten the provisions in this bill. To their great credit, the Future Fund divested, not just of companies that were directly implicated in making these weapons, but companies that were indirectly implicated. And they are very well aware that the drafting of this legislation, which obviously wasn't in force at the time they made that decision, wouldn't have required them to do that. And so another gigantic loophole. This one, I hope, an error. This one may not have been intentional, because I can see there's no strategic reason for it. There's nothing about enabling investment in these weapons necessarily that involves sucking up to the United States. So if that's not what it's about, then I very much look forward to hearing the reasons why it's been drafted as it is. The report recognised, the report of the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Committee, which our Acting Deputy President chaired, heard from witnesses right across the spectrum, from the financial industry and from the Cluster Munitions Coalition that has spent such a long period of time representing a very large number of civil society groups here in Australia and around the world, gave compelling evidence to the committee on behalf of their membership that these, at that stage, I don't believe we'd seen those WikiLeaks revelations, and it appeared to the committee, and the evidence as presented to the committee was, well, this must have been a giant mistake. These must have been drafting errors. So as drafting errors, they could be fixed, and we came up with propositions for doing that. And then, a short while after that, we were informed that, in fact, no, they weren't errors at all. These loopholes are there for a reason. They've been drafted that way to make sure that the bill is in violation with the objectives of the Convention itself. We agreed and shared the concerns of the Cluster Munition Coalition, who point to the fact that the Convention on Cluster Munitions states that parties should, and I'll quote, never under any circumstances engage in prohibited activities related to cluster weapons. That involves joint operations in which we are implicit in using these weapons, as we were during Operation Desert Storm on the way into Baghdad. The Convention also insists that you will not be stockpiling stores of these weapons for deployment by a non-state party. And of course, what possible rationale could there be for leaving that possibility wide open? What New Zealand has done in this regard in its implementation legislation, which went into force in 2009, allows for joint military operations while preserving the Convention's prohibitions. There are ways of doing this, of course there are. New Zealand's law criminalises all activities prohibited by the Convention's Article 1. On the issue of foreign forces stockpiling these weapons on Australian soil, we need to take a look at Austria, or the way that Colombia or Guatemala or Slovenia brought the Convention into domestic law and found a way of not undermining the basic objectives of the treaty. And in terms of investment, I think, again, we have an amendment that would solve the investment issue, that would simply make it illegal to inadvertently, perhaps, or intentionally invest, as the country's financial community spoke so compellingly at the committee hearing. This bill should not pass in its current form, and I look forward to contributions from other senators explaining why they think the bill in its current form, when it's been so dramatically critiqued by people who know a great deal more about the way that this convention was designed to operate. The convention is designed to be universal, and it is designed for the eradication of these horrific weapons. There are no if nor buts. Other countries have shown that there are ways of preserving interoperability without damaging the way that this convention was intended to come into force. Surely it is not beyond the wit of this legislature and this Senate. People are looking to this chamber tonight to fix the flaws in this dramatically unfortunate bill that simply should never have seen the light of day. If it is the government's intention to sabotage the Cluster Weapons Convention, then at least have the guts to come out and say so. I thank the chamber.